Earlier today, General Motors and I reached a substantial agreement on a modified version of the legislation I introduced with Senator Blumenthal that will ensure the public disclosure of information about fatal accidents that might have been caused by safety defects. One reason why the bill is needed is because I simply do not have the confidence that NHTSA will take more aggressive action in the future. Whether it is NHTSA or the NFL, there must be accountability for any organization that turns a blind eye when it knows a harm is being done. Mr. Friedman, you have repeatedly said that it was GM that stood in the way of safety, that GM failed to tell NHTSA everything it knew about the defective ignition switches, and that if it had, the government would have acted differently. It goes without saying that GM made and sold the vehicles in which so many innocent victims were killed or injured. But I am gravely disappointed in the Transportation Department's failure to accept even a shred of responsibility. For an entire decade, NHTSA had meetings, reports, secret documents submitted by GM to the early warning reporting system that all describe fatal accidents involving ignition switches that cause cars to stall all by themselves, but NHTSA did nothing. And while GM's leaders have described the GM nod, which was said to occur when everyone in a meeting all nodded their heads, but then did nothing to solve safety problems, what I see at NHTSA is the NHTSA shrug. NHTSA shrugged when it agreed with GM that cars stalling on their own did not pose a safety problem. NHTSA shrugged when it read its own contractors' reports linking the ignition switch defect to fatal accidents in which airbags didn't deploy. NHTSA shrugged when it obtained secret documents from GM that spelled out exactly what was causing these crashes. NHTSA has not acknowledged its own failures to take action. It has not apologized to the families who have lost children, siblings, spouses, and parents, and it has not yet announced strong measures to ensure that it does not fail the American public this way in the future. So my first question to you is, are you prepared to apologize for NHTSA to those families that were harmed by the defects in these vehicles?
Senator, in my first hearing, I expressed my deepest sympathies and my sadness at the loss of life from each and every one of these tragedies. But I want to be clear, NHTSA did not shrug. NHTSA, over the last few years, forcing Chrysler to recall vehicles that they refused to agree were defective is not a shrug. NHTSA forcing Graco to recall vehicles is not a shrug. NHTSA diving into the data on this issue, having special crash investigators on the job on this issue, looking at the data, following the data is not a shrug. NHTSA aggressively pursues these issues and continues to do so today.
I disagree with you, Mr. Friedman, when you agreed with GM that cars stalling on their own did not pose a safety problem.
Senator,
that is wrong. When you did not, in fact, read your own contractors' reports linking the ignition switch defect to fatal accidents in which airbags did not deploy, that is on NHTSA. You just can't say it was an airbag problem. There was a fundamental problem with the car just stopping. It was an ignition problem. So it's not an airbag problem. So NHTSA's wrong there as well. And when you did obtain the secret documents from GM that spelled out exactly what was causing these crashes, that should have been made public immediately. We should have understood as a nation what these problems were. So I just disagree with you, Mr. Friedman, okay? I just disagree with you. I think that there was a higher duty which you owed. According to Mr. Volukas's report in 2004, GM and NHTSA had a secret meeting in which the attendees inexplicably agreed that cars stalled all by themselves, but that this was not necessarily a safety problem. Earlier this summer, GM CEO Mary Barra and others agreed with me that the public would probably have rejected the conclusion that cars stalling all by themselves was not a safety problem if they had known about it. Do you also agree that with Mary Barra, that the public would have rejected that conclusion, that these cars stalling on their own was in fact a safety measure, a safety problem, if the public had known.
Senator, we have aggressively pursued stalling issues over the years with 42 investigations, 31 recalls over the last 10 years. When we see a stalling incident that creates an unreasonable risk to safety, we act, and there's no doubt about that. One of the things that is incredibly important to us is we do have to communicate.
But do you agree? Will you say that NHTSA got it wrong when it found that cars stalling on their own was not a safety problem? Will you agree that was a mistake that NHTSA made?
Senator, in this General Motors case, the ignition switch and the stall was linked to airbags not deploying, and that is clearly a safety issue.
Again, but the safety bags not deploying is a safety issue, but a car's ignition not working and shutting off the car automatically is a separate safety issue. So even if you had no airbags and you were driving in the car, I don't think the American public would feel safe if the car automatically was turning off because there's an ignition problem. And again, I keep waiting for you to close this gap so that you admit that there were two safety issues here. One was airbags, but the other was the ignition shutting off and the car just stalling out, perhaps on the highway. You do agree that's a separate issue and that was something that the public should have been warned about. Do you not?
There's no doubt that stalling can be a serious safety issue.
Okay. And do you agree that NHTSA should have made that clear to the American public? That's what I'm waiting for in terms of the apology, the statement to the public that there should have been a warning coming from the government once that information was in the hands of NHTSA.
Senator, we get many, many thousands of complaints about stalling. And in this case, when we look at the data, these vehicles didn't stand out. If a consumer can safely pull their vehicle over to the side of the road and restart that vehicle, then that's a situation where the consumer can be safe, but obviously the car company does need to address any stalling issue that represents a safety risk.
Well, in 2007, NHTSA asked for and received a secret document from GM related to the death of 2 Wisconsin teenagers. That document was first made public by me at our May 7th hearing, and it is referenced repeatedly in Mr. Valukas' report. It included a report by the Wisconsin State Patrol Academy that said that the ignition switch defect prevented the airbags from deploying. It also found other examples of the same problems happening in other cars and identified a 2005 GM warning to dealers about the issue. In short, it correctly identified the safety defect. Do you agree with me that GM CEO Mary Barra and others that said that if the public had been able to read the secret document and warned about its conclusions at the time, it is possible that some of the deaths and injuries caused by this defect could have been avoided?
Well, Senator, the special crash investigation report that included these same assertions was a public document, and no one brought that issue to our attention.
No, the document that I'm talking about is not a public document.
I understand, but
well, let's talk about the public. Let's talk about this non-public document. What if this non-public document had been made public? Do you agree that if it had been made public, that it could have avoided unnecessary deaths having occurred?
Senator, I agree that making this kind of information with privacy-protected public can be a positive and helpful thing. What I don't agree with, though, is putting the burden for making that information public with privacy-protected should fall on NHTSA. I believe that burden should fall onto the industry who is causing these problems. So in conversation with your staff, in providing technical assistance, we suggested that we should support getting this information out there, but the car company should be the one responsible for the costs and the time and the effort to make that information publicly available because they're creating the problems in the first place.
Well, when a document is given to you in 2007 by GM and it's only made public this year, there's a big problem. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Fisher.